everybody. Welcome to the Tea with Us podcast. And I wanted to say that we're now on Spotify and Apple podcasts and iTunes. So please subscribe to our podcast, leave a review, and while you're at it, please follow us on Instagram at Taz Kadri Studios. That's TAZKHATRI Studios. And you can also sign up for our newsletter, our quarterly newsletter, which is on our website, tazkadristudios.com. And just to give you an overview, Taz Kadri Studios is an architecture firm based in Phoenix. And we work on small commercial projects, residential, ground up and remodels, historic homes in the historic neighborhoods, remodels to those, and also the missing middle small multifamily. So that is a little bit about us. And I'm really excited to have Jennifer on this podcast today because I know Jen through my historic preservation work. I sit on the Historic Sites Review Committee, and Jennifer is a consultant that often brings us nominations for properties. So I've gotten to know Jen in that way. I'm really excited today because we're going to be talking about the first licensed female architect in Arizona. And I had never heard of this woman until Jen had brought her up in one of the nominations she was discussing at a meeting. And I got really excited. And I was like, why haven't I have heard of this person? And, as expected, a lot of her work has been overlooked. And I wanted to rectify that in a little way, and talk about this woman. Her name was Annie Rockfellow. So let me give you an introduction of Jen and her bio. So Jennifer Levstik has 26 years of experience in cultural resources management and historic preservation. She has worked throughout Arizona, New Mexico, California, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, and Colorado, and has broad experience as an architectural historian, archaeological field director, and planner. She was the former lead planner for the City of Tucson Historic Preservation Office and has extensive experience preparing National Register of Historic Places nominations and eligibility reports, Historic American Building Survey, engineering record, and landscape level documentation, building condition and assessment, documentation, historic preservation master plans, and architectural inventories. Jennifer also serves as an adjunct instructor with the University of Arizona's College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture, is the vice chair of the Tucson-Pima County Historical Commission, and formerly served on the board of the Southern Arizona chapter of the American Institute of Architects. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. It should be a fun discussion today.
Yeah, I'm so excited that you're here and we get to tap into your vast knowledge. So I'm really excited. So tell us a little bit about how Annie Rockfellow got her start, and around which years was she an architect here in Arizona?
Yeah, so she's originally from upstate New York. She was born around 1866, I believe. And so she was born to a fairly affluent family. She traveled around Europe a lot, and she happened to be interested in art and architecture and design. And right when she was ready to go to college, MIT actually had its first architecture program that was established. And that was the first year that women were also allowed to join. And so she applied for the program, she got in. Of course, she did a truncated program because she was a woman, so she wasn't allowed to do the full program.
Huh.
But interestingly, so during this time, one of the family friends was an architect named William Walker. And he told her, he said, look, if you could go through this program and get your degree, I'll hire you. And so she got her first job immediately out of school, and she worked again, and she's still in New York at this time. And she worked with him for a few years, and his business failed. I guess there was like an economic depression or something at the time that she was working for him. And so she, after that, she took some time, she traveled around quite a bit. She participated in several kind of architectural, contests and things like that. And so her work kind of got picked up in some of the magazines. And so she had, brief little roles in small firms, like they also in New York and then in Detroit. And so during this time, her father got sick and he moved to Tucson, and her brother also moved to Tucson. And so she started visiting Tucson to be with her family. And I'm not entirely sure, how she did this, but so she had she did actually have her own firm up in New York.
Oh,
And
okay.
at some point she gets her license. I don't know the exact year in which she gets her license, but she gets her license sometime before 1916, sometime between when she graduated, which was like around I want to say 1875, something like that. And sometime in this time when she's visiting her dad, she meets Henry Josted. So Henry Josted is one of the architects in Tucson that has, a huge portfolio. There's at least 500 projects that are attributed to him. And so when people do research on Tucson architectural history, he's one of the people's, that names that pops up frequently. And at some point, I don't know how she met him, but he asked her if she would be interested in helping him with a design competition to design a YMCA building in Miami, Arizona, one of the mining towns. And they won the competition. And so he asked her to work for him, and she said, well, let me think about it. And so she traveled again, which she was known to do. So she went to San Diego, and that was around 1915 when that was the Panama, it was the California Panama Exposition. I think that's the name. I might be getting it wrong. But so that seems to be the key kind of factor in her design aesthetic from that point after. And so she goes to this exhibition. Revival sort of architectural is very, very popular. And she's really inspired by what she sees. And so she comes back and she tells Henry, yes, I will work for you. And so she begins her career with him in 1916. And she stays with him for 22 years until she retires in 1938.
Okay.
And during that time, she basically becomes his chief designer during that time. And it's really interesting because if you look at Josted's sort of body of work, and the other interesting thing too is that he was not a licensed architect when he hired her. So he didn't become a licensed architect until like 1922 or something. So she may have been one of the few licensed architects in his firm at the time. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But of course, everything's under his name. But yeah, so if you look at kind of that body of work of his work, and then when she comes and starts working for him in 1916, there is a perceptible shift in the kind of work that's coming out of his office. And so, and again, it's not to say that he wasn't a good architect, but it's a very different design aesthetic that happens. And suddenly you have much more complex, more ornate buildings. Revivalist for architecture is very, very popular, of course, at the time. And so she kind of reinforces that. So suddenly Josted's, quote unquote, Josted's portfolio now is Spanish colonial revival, mission revival, Pueblo revival, very ornate buildings. When up until that point, his buildings never looked like that. And then after she retired, and he still continued to practice, I think, until the 50s or so. So there's those breaks in time in which she wasn't working there. It's very clear which things she had a hand in and which things were Josted or whoever else was working with him at the time. But yeah, that's kind of the sort of the general trajectory of, of her kind of like her career, sort of basically, like 1887 to about 1938. So she was definitely a pioneer. That's a really early time frame for women architects, especially in Arizona, which, in the 80s and stuff, it's a fairly rural place. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so she came to Arizona in, you were saying 1916, right?
So she would come and sort of come back and forth. So I think the earliest she came was like in 1910 or so.
Okay.
And then eventually she came and settled here full time when she decided to take the job with Josted, who I'll also note was also the mayor of Tucson for like 14 years out of that time that they were working together too. So he was quite well known. So that's probably partly why he got a lot of work too. He
Uh-huh.
was the mayor of town. So
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. And he probably like didn't really have time to do the architecture stuff. So she was probably doing a lot of the bulk of that
yes,
work.
yes. That's the impression too. Yeah. But again, her name is not specifically on those drawings, but it's very clear which of those things were hers and not hers, basically.
Uh-huh. And she'd never stamped any drawings.
I don't know. I mean, there's a couple, I would have to look at them to see, but that's a good question because I know that even at the time that some of these buildings were being designed and constructed, that she was given credit for those publicly.
Hmm,
So the El Conquistador Hotel, which no longer exists, was a monumental project that was publicly known that she was the architect of record for that. But again, without seeing the drawings, no. I mean, the drawings of hers, of projects that I have attributed to her or others who have done research have attributed to her, do not have her name on them. They
okay.
just they have Henry's name on them.
I see. So that must have been after he got licensed.
It must have been, yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
So interesting. Yeah, it's kind of curious as to what they did in the beginning when he wasn't licensed. So
Yeah.
I don't know if he was just like general contractor or what that title would have been at the time, because yeah, her name is not on them.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, so so really this is she just worked for Henry Josted here in Tucson, right? Um,
Yes, at least in Arizona, that's who she worked for the entire time she was here before she retired. She did, like I said, she had a small practice of her own up in New York for a few years. And she did work at some other firms, but again, the firms, I don't know anything about those firms, as to kind of what kind of work that they did. But yeah, and then she did have a brief stint in Tucson teaching at the University of Arizona for a little while. But again, she wasn't teaching in architecture, they didn't give her a job there. So she was teaching English and geography, which apparently she didn't really like very much. And
uh-huh.
she would teach, the architecture students drafting like on the side to make up for it. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, most of her career, I mean, the large bulk of her career anyways, was spent in Arizona working for Josted.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And was she married or had children?
No, it doesn't appear that she was ever married. There are references to her partner. So she had a female partner. But again, given the time frame, her partner was never named in any of the documents, and even in some of her like autobiographical files that they have at the Historical Society, there's no name or anything. It's a very, very vague. It's very vague. But again, given the time period, it's kind of not surprising.
Right, right, for sure. So, and
Yeah.
then yeah, she sounds like a remarkable woman because she must have been a real pioneer at that time
Oh
to
yeah.
overcome all those barriers and cultural barriers to become the first licensed architect here in Arizona. And then also, she must have been one of the first in New York, right? She got licensed in New York.
Yeah, at MIT, yeah, I believe so. And so, yeah, she probably would have been one of the early ones in New York as well. Yeah. I was sort of thinking about this before we talked today about kind of who her contemporaries were, because I was like, well, who else was, doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of looked up a few people that I had thought of myself. And so, Mary Coulter, who's, fairly well known, who did all the work for the Fred Harvey Company. So she would have been a contemporary. They're almost identical as far sort of when they were born and when they passed away. So the
Huh.
time frames in which they were working was pretty identical. And
Mhm.
then the other person that I thought of too would have been Julia Morgan, who did the Hearst Castle and some of those places in California. And again, she would have also been a contemporary to Annie. So
Mhm.
those are kind of the three big women that I know of. I'm sure there's others, but
Mhm.
those are the three, I mean, so Annie is, in that category, I think, with,
Mhm.
the Julia Morgans and the Mary Coulters. And so, yeah, so they all would have been working at the same time. They were all they used very revivalist architecture, very ornate, complicated designs and things like that. So they're pretty extravagant, compared to some of the other work that was going on at the same time. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Where was Mary Coulter and were Julia Morgan, were they kind of famous and well known at the time, or were they only posthumously well known?
Well, I think Julia Morgan was, since Hearst sought her out specifically, she must have been well enough known for him to have actually sought her out to do the design. And
Mhm,
then I think Mary Coulter started, and it's been a while since I read up on Fred Harvey, but
mhm,
he picked her out. I think she originally started out sort of designing uh like not necessarily souvenirs, but sort of like accoutrements for the cars and wherever they stopped, kind of sort of souvenirs and things like for the tourists that took the train.
mhm,
And she was kind of a designer, kind of interior designer, and she'd do those sorts of things. And then so I don't think she started out sort of well known like Julia Morgan did.
mhm,
But she sort of came into it, and then she started doing the designs for a lot of these train stop, like hotels and things for the Fred Harvey tours. And she became his chief architect and ended up designing all of these now very famous hotels that are along the Santa Fe, the Santa Fe Railroad trails and those kinds of things. So yeah, but I think I think she was sort of kind of randomly discovered. I could be totally wrong on that because again, it's been a long time since I read up on it, but that's the impression I have anyway.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and it seems like Annie Rockfellow was not well known during her life, probably. And even now, she's not well known, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in the time that I have been doing preservation work and doing projects that she would have worked on, that the information about her has changed, has shifted. So,
Hmm.
I think for a very long time, I think anybody that was as an architect working locally would have known her. And it seems that she was, very well respected. But as far as sort of the wider public, probably not until more recently, where there has been a concerted effort now on projects in which people have typically attributed them to Henry Josted, are now taking a second look at those projects and going, are we sure that's Henry? Because let's look at how this is designed and what's the time period in which this was done. And so now there is a concerted effort to go back and kind of sort of correct the record. So all of these things that originally been given to Henry, attributed to him, are now saying under his office, and Annie Rockfellow as the architect or chief designer, those kinds of things. So she's kind of getting the recognition that she's due. And
Mhm,
I did notice, I just out of curiosity too, so I just kind of Googled her just to see like how much stuff is on the internet about her.
mhm,
And there is I think the National Trust for Historic Preservation actually featured her as one of 3 women that they thought were really important architects.
hmm.
And there is a book, I guess it's coming out about, sort of, you know, I guess, top female architects, in the United States. And so they've included her in there. So that's really nice to see. So I
Yeah.
think that she's slowly but surely getting the recognition that she deserves. Unfortunately, it's well after she's passed, but yeah,
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, no, but it's still really important um,
yeah,
to know that she was practicing way back in the day and that she was a pioneer.
yes.
So yeah, for sure. Um, so she was it seems like she was the chief designer in Josted's firm. And can you tell me some of the maybe a well-known place in Tucson that she may have been involved with?
Yeah. So there's probably way more than we actually give her credit for. So there's some things that I've seen that were still credited to Josted that I know for sure are not hers. So one of which is the project that you reviewed, which
Mm-hmm.
is the Luve Campus Agricultural Center. Again, that's mostly people in Tucson know that place. But the Safford Elementary School, which is downtown, that's one of hers.
Hmm.
And if your audience is interested, you could go to Archipedia, which is a architecture Wikipedia, and you
Mhm.
can Google Safford School or type in Safford School, and there's pictures and information about the school, and also a little bit more about her too in there. One of the other buildings, well, some of the other buildings she's been involved in were there's actually two, but one of them is again, a YMCA here in Tucson at West University. And that one is a very elaborate Spanish colonial building. It's no longer a YMCA, but it's, it's now used for, I think, maybe a nonprofit or something. She also worked on several tuberculosis sanatoriums, one of which was the Desert Sanatorium, which is now part of Tucson Medical Center. But sort of deep in the recesses of the Tucson Medical Center, there's still all of these beautiful Pueblo revival buildings that still survive. And some of those are hers as well. Let's see. So I'm trying to think of more sort of classic ones. A lot of them, unfortunately, have been torn down. So there's some big commercial buildings in downtown Tucson that no longer exist, several residences. But I really think probably what she was most known for, which unfortunately is gone, which I brought up a little bit earlier, was the El Conquistador Hotel. And that is now where the El Con shopping mall is. So, and that was probably her largest project. That was in 28, I think. I think they're at 28 or so. It didn't last very long. The Depression hit and it basically collapsed, the financially collapsed. And so they abandoned it. But at that point, it would have been sort of the farthest reaches of Tucson on the east end of town. And that's where all of the sort of high-end suburbs were getting created. So for the sort of the wealthy elite were living right there. And so then they created this gigantic resort and hotel. It was probably that, and that would have been the one too that she was like locally known for doing. But that's another one too that if people are interested, you could just Google El Conquistador Hotel. Or El Con Hotel, and you could find historic photos of it to see how monumental this place was before it was demolished, unfortunately, in 1960 for a shopping mall that they just tore down like 10 years ago because they didn't like it. So so those are some of the projects, but so she kind of did everything too. So it's commercial properties, residential, more institutional properties. So she ran the gamut of project types.
Yeah, and I imagine at that time, there would have been a lot of work because Tucson was just getting developed, right? There was a lot of like a population boom and
yes,
lots to do, lots of work coming.
Yeah. And I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure that Josted being the mayor probably helped. There wasn't a ton of competition. So the only other person that I think would have been major competition at that point would have been Roy Place that moved into Tucson around that time. And he's sort of her contemporary and probably comparable as far as some of the design aesthetic goes. Because he was very successful, very, very talented. I would have to say way more talented than Josted, but he would have been sort of her, I don't know, competition, so to speak, I think, as far as work in Tucson.
You may not know the answer to this, but do you know why she chose to stay with Josted instead of, opening her own firm? Or it sounds like it was a good partnership with them because he got the work and she probably had free reign to do whatever she wanted. I imagine. No.
Yeah, I don't actually know the answer to it. I know that, he clearly respected her because he sought her out. So, I'd like to give him credit for seeing her talent early on and immediately going, what can I do? Please work with me, and giving her the top job in his architecture firm. So, I'm assuming that one, it was a good relationship, or at least she had enough freedom there that she could do what she wanted. My assumption is the reason that she probably didn't go out on her own was probably the fact that she was a woman. I'm assuming that's probably part of it, and that it would have been very hard. And again, if she's working, some of the most productive years that they have projects are right during the Depression, so it's probably pretty scary to leave a job, that you have, given what's going on with everybody else, so if she's, if that 29 and even up to the late 30s, you still have some of those same Depression era issues. So, I'm sure it's economic thing, as well as just sort of dealing with the, day-to-day sexism that was going on. You
Right,
know,
right. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, it sounds like it was really a perfect partnership because Josted probably had all of this clout and credibility
yeah,
because he was the mayor, and then which she would not have had if she were out on her own,
right.
like people wouldn't approach her because she's a woman. So
Yeah,
this was really an
yeah. She would
opportunity.
almost have needed, yeah, she would almost have needed some sort of like a very wealthy kind of benefactor type person that could then, tell other people to hire her, because I think that's what kind of happened with some of the women that came after her,
Mhm.
to some extent, is that, they had to work really hard to be able to go out on their own and to
Mhm.
get the credit they deserved, frankly. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting because she used this partnership as a way to, get to work on really cool buildings, like big projects, which she may not
Yeah.
have gotten if she was on her own. And at the same time, was lost to history for a while because we didn't, yeah, her name wasn't on, she didn't get the credit for it. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
it is curious. It's curious to see, I would have loved to have known her personal opinion on that,
mhm,
because all of the descriptions of her was that she's this very independent, very sharp, very smart, and so this sort of perception of her is very different than knowing that this woman has, up until, again, probably the last 15, maybe not even quite 20, but 15 years, has been sort of not entirely erased, but kind of erased, so
mhm.
unless you know what you're looking for, unless you knew about it, you wouldn't know about her. And, which seems in opposition to her personality and the way she's described and how strong and independent she was, that it's
Mhm.
hard to believe that she would have been okay with people not knowing. But maybe, maybe she was just so confident she didn't care.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt she was strong and confident because you have to be to do what she did in that
Oh yeah.
time. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was like incredible that she was able to do that. Um, and maybe it was strategic that she, worked for Josted and then also just took sort of that risk that she may not get the credit. I mean, I can see that as a strategic move on her part. So
Yeah.
we don't know though. um
Right.
yeah, I think a lot of women back then had to make those decisions, right? Like, how am I gonna work and get to work on these cool projects, right? So
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
yeah.
And probably you were just used to it. You just knew that that was the way it was going to be. And so,
Mhm.
it was better to have the career that you wanted, and maybe you don't get the same level of credit, but the fact that she was able to do what she was able to and have that kind of career, regardless of the accolades or not, was pretty amazing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then also, if she were out on her own, she would have been more exposed to criticism and even,
Yes.
people wanting to sabotage her, just people who are against having a woman be, she was kind of like under the radar, which was
Yeah.
smart in a lot of ways.
Yes. Yes, that's true. Yeah. She would have definitely been open for, yeah, much more criticism.
Mhm.
Yeah, rather than them getting a plan from a man, and they're like, wow, this is fantastic,
Yeah, yeah, which is kind of heartbreaking for us women now to
Uh-huh.
see that that's how it was, but it was probably necessary. It was a necessary step to
Right.
getting us here. So,
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
yeah. Um, so what do you think is something that most people don't know about Annie?
Something they don't know about her. Well, again, some of it is just this sort of lack of awareness that, you know, she had this really amazing portfolio, and we're probably talking hundreds of buildings. And right now, people are maybe attributing 20 of those buildings to her.
Mhm.
Um, and, again, the fact that she's probably one of maybe less than, a handful of women in the entire United States who's doing what she's doing. And that we're lucky enough to have her in Tucson. And that, I think one of the sort of legacies of hers that we should all be, grateful for, or at least acknowledge, is the fact that when we look at Arizona's kind of architectural vocabulary during the historic period and all of those iconic buildings that we love and we're so concerned about preserving, is that she's part of that legacy and she's part of that vocabulary. And, really, like, again, up until recently, there has been the Roy Places or the Jostads or the Jostlers, or the Art Browns or whoever it is, that have always been sort of looked at as kind of the fathers of Tucson architecture, rather than realizing that probably one of the most predominant and prolific of the architects during that time period was this woman. And so when we look around and we love all of these properties and everything, it would be nice to know that they're recognizing the work of a woman architect in Tucson who helped create that aesthetic that we have today.
Yeah, for sure. It
Yeah.
sounds like she was a very important architect and in the history of architecture in Tucson, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I would absolutely agree. And again, because of the time period, and again, given how many projects she's worked on that I'm aware of, they're all still standing and they're great projects. And they're very few people would look at them and think, oh no, we should not preserve that. There's some things from the sort of the modernist movement where you'll have a lot more dialogue about, like, why would you keep that, but certainly with the work that she's done, regardless of your love for historic preservation or architecture or not, most people kind of universally agree, like, wow, that's a great building, that's a beautiful building, we should definitely preserve it. So it's, so the work that she does has lasted beyond her, so that other people still appreciate it, rather than being something that's very specific to a time period. Again, not everybody wants a Brady Bunch house. Some people love it. Everybody in Phoenix loves them, right? But not everybody does. And so my mom, that's her era, and she's like, I don't know why anybody wants those houses, right? But at least Annie's work, everybody can look at that and go, I get that, I understand that, I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I It's not uncommon for like really big name architects to have like a woman working in the background, or like Le Corbusier had some women that were really involved in a lot of his major works, but they really, obviously we don't even know their names, but or most people don't know their names, but it's kind of coming out of the woodworks now. So it's not unusual. This whole thing was not unusual, where women went to work for these great architects, and they were obviously very talented, because these great architects wouldn't have hired them otherwise. And at the same time, it was too risky for them to go out on their own. And then also they were under the wing of these people who got to do amazing public works, that they would not have had the chance to do. And like I said, their name is lost to history, but now it's coming back. Like you're saying, people are more interested in, like, oh, there was a woman who worked on this Le Corbusier project.
Yeah. Well, and as one of the challenges too is that, and this isn't necessarily, sort of overt sexism. It's kind of the nature of how architecture firms work, right? Which is regardless of who you are, typically it falls under the umbrella of the name of the firm. It's not you as a specific individual. It is a team effort, and you're not often going to get recognition at the individual level. So, in spite of the fact that it's, unfortunate that she was sort of hidden for all of these years, at the same time, I don't think it was purposeful, hiding of her, but it was more of just the nature of how firms work. Because even today, as somebody who owns their own firm, you can probably attest to this too.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And having worked for other people, they took the credit for things that I did. So yeah, it is just the way that it is. So, and I think like we know Frank Lloyd Wright, he had so many people work on his projects,
Yeah.
and he made sure they didn't get any credit.
Oh yeah, definitely him for sure. I would not have trusted him to give anybody any credit. No.
No, right? So, and he was mad, when somebody claimed credit. So, um, I think it's an unfortunate part of the way architecture works, because it is such a team process, and there's so many people who work on it, and it is, unfair that we attribute it to like the owner,
Yeah.
because obviously, most likely, they had a very, very little to do with it.
Yes. Yes. They looked at the final and they're like, okay, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
maybe you could answer this. Is there somewhere that you guys would like put your initials in or something?
Yeah,
So that
wouldn't that be
somebody
great?
like a researcher like me years down the road can go, oh, it was Taz. Yeah.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great? I think that's so
Yeah.
cool. That would be, I know, but we're not there yet, even today, where people don't really get the credit they deserve. I mean, a little bit more if you look at architecture magazines,
Yeah.
you can see like who's the designer. They try to give more credit to like the team, more and more now, which is good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so, uh, well, I think we've covered this a little bit, but why do you think that Annie Rockfellow isn't well known today? I mean, is it because she worked for Justed? But or is that the main reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, like we just talked about, which is again, it's just the nature of architecture firms and how they attribute work. So there's certainly that part of it. Again, a lot of it is just, a function of the times in which she lived, which is that it was unlikely that she would have gotten the credit. And if she did get the credit, it was because she would have had to have gone out on her own, which means that she probably would not have had the portfolio that she has, because people would not have given her the work. And so we wouldn't have really known much about her then either, because she probably would not, or highly unlikely that she would have been as prolific as she was if she was by herself.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting because, I've looked at, again, looking at sort of who came after her, and sort of what they were able to accomplish. And it's interesting because at least, in Tucson, again, and I can't speak to the rest of the state, obviously I'm very Tucson specific because that's more of the history that I know because I live here. But, Annie retires in 1938, and it's not until 1950 that you have the next registered female architect in Arizona,
Wow.
and that's Anne Rysdale, and
Uh-huh.
she ends up coming. She kind of comes and goes from Tucson, but eventually settles in Tucson to work as an architect. But it's interesting that there's still a huge gap in time. And even when Anne started working, I mean, she originally worked for Art Brown, and then she went off on her own, and she
Hmm.
managed to have a fairly successful career. I mean, people at least knew who she was.
Mhm.
Um, but when she was still alive, she actually came to Tucson during one of our Modernism Week events. And so she spoke about it. And it was really difficult for her. I mean, one of the things that she pointed out, and having her point that out makes me kind of look at Annie's work a little bit differently too, which is that she said in order to be successful, she had to make sure that her work was better than all of the men,
Mhm.
and so she said there was an extra push to make sure that it was, it was more cutting edge, or it was more elaborate, or something about it so that it stood out so that she could get that commission,
Mhm.
and then if you, again, and if talking about that relationship of Annie and Josted, where his work is fairly simple, it's nothing flashy, it's practical, it works, again, not terrible, but it's nothing special. But then she comes in and it's just sort of an explosion of, Spanish colonial details. And again, I'm not trying to make it sound gaudy because it's not, it's very well done. But again, it's like she, not only am I suggesting that she doesn't have talent, but she had to do that, I think, to some extent, to make sure that she stood out and she would get the work. And,
Mhm.
and even, in 1950 through, I think Anne worked through the 80s, I think, through the 1980s. But even so, I mean, she said it was kind of a continual issue, and trying to come up with ways to get work that wasn't, that was not based on whether or not she was a woman or not.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, even today, it's a problem, And even today, in 2023, we there's very few women designers, there's a big gap. Most people who focus on design, most architects who focus on design are men. There's a
Mhm.
huge gap. There aren't a lot of women that are designers. And I think the point that you made about women having to be like double talented to even get their foot in the door, I'm sure is a part of that. And also I think there is women are encouraged to become project managers. Women are encouraged to do sort of have other roles in the profession, but like the designer is really like the jewel of the crown, right? Like they're very esteemed, and women don't normally get that position in firms even today. So it's
Mhm.
remarkable that Annie Rockfellow was such a great designer, and at a time when it was just impossible for women. So it and the fact that her history has been erased, and but is now coming back. I mean, it's so important for women today to know about what she accomplished. I mean,
Mhm.
it's changing. It would change the world today.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
and I think and again, it may give people, women that are in the architecture program, because, like I said, I've done, adjunct faculty there. And so there's lots of women that
Hmm.
I've met that are, very talented, but they don't end up going into it. Or if they
Hmm.
do, they're not doing what, they're doing more of the project management, sort of those kinds of tasks, rather than what they set out to do, which was to be, a
Hmm.
designer with great ideas and everything else and stuff. So maybe knowing these stories of somebody like Annie, and even Anne Rysdale, and then after her, Judith Chafee. I mean, these are all very prominent, well-respected, really talented female architects, and
Hmm.
knowing that they exist, although too few of them, but knowing that there is a future, there is a possibility out there, because if you are talented, it's possible.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And even I think having the confidence to go after those jobs instead of just being satisfied with like, oh, well, I'm a project manager or whatever. But if that's your
Yeah,
passion, then becoming the designer.
yeah,
Um, yeah, and I've heard of Anne Rysdale and Judith Chafee, both of those names. Maybe because I'm involved in the historic preservation world a little bit
yeah,
more
yeah.
than most architects, but um even so, I had never heard of Annie Rockfellow, and so that's why, um, yeah, I'm glad her name is coming out now, from underneath all the rubble.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's so important, especially knowing that she was such an early pioneer, like 1938, she retired. I mean, it's hard to imagine, and even the architectural
I
style
know.
was so different. And it's really hard to imagine how she did it. She was really, really remarkable.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you just look at the years that she's productive, it's insane to think about, you know, just being able to do what she did at that time. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's, even just technologically, just the amount of hours and time it would have been to draw everything and to measure everything, and, those kinds of things.
Mhm.
So, I mean, yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It's pretty amazing, and it sounds like, she was able to do a lot of this stuff because she came from a privileged background, and
Mhm.
she had money, and she was able to travel, and she had some freedom, to do things, experiment, and, but amazingly, she was able to just catapult so far ahead with this privilege that she had.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, she did not squander it.
He did not squander it, which is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah. So um you had mentioned Anne Rysdale. Do you think Anne Rysdale knew of Annie Rockfellow?
I think she did because, I mean, one of the interesting things that she had pointed out was that, she was the only woman to be like only licensed female architect in Arizona at the time that she was practicing, and that her predecessor was Annie. So she was aware of
Mhm.
it. Again, because it must be, must be a small enough kind of community at that time to at least know who she was.
Mhm.
Because, Anne, I mean, Annie would have been in San Diego at that time, so I don't know if they would have had much crossover, but Jocelyn was certainly around, and I'm sure that she was aware of it because, when Anne was living here too. So, but yeah, and then Judith, Chafee, I mean, she didn't come here, I think, till the 70s.
Mhm.
And again, both Anne Rysdale and Judith went off on their own. They started working for big name, I mean, I think Judith worked for like Walter Gropius at one point. I mean,
Wow.
she worked for the cream of the crop. And
Yeah.
so, but yeah, she did something same as Anne, as they both decided to come back to Tucson and just start their own businesses. And, most of the work that they did was largely residential. They
Mhm.
didn't get a ton of commercial work. I mean, I think Judith only did residential. And
Mhm.
again, because they were women, so
Mhm.
it's harder to get those really big jobs.
Mhm.
But the work that they did do, though, is yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Mhm. Right. And it's interesting that they went out on their own because even today, because a lot of women are not promoted to the principal level, in
Yeah.
leadership, there's still a big gap. A lot of women, because they just don't get promoted to that top level, they start their own businesses.
Yep.
And so that would explain, and you're right. The cost of that is that you don't get to work on those big commissions that big firms get.
Right.
But at least you get the full freedom and self-expression and credit, that you wouldn't get at a bigger firm. So it's not unusual for really, the independent women to just give up on the corporate life because they just don't get promoted in architecture. I mean, it's even today, there's a big
Yeah.
gap. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I know. I mean, if I think about some of the large architecture firms that I know of, and yeah, most of the women are, like you said, I mean, if they do move up through the food chain, they're still in a management role. They're not
Mhm.
that designer role. So
Right.
yeah, it still clearly happens. And even at the, sort of a national level, when you think about who the sort of top architects are,
Mhm.
um, there's not too many women's names that come up.
Mm-mm.
And the ones that do are ones that have eventually had their own firm, or they're just so amazingly talented that no matter, you couldn't not hire them because they are just so stunningly talented.
Right. And that goes back to your point of, they have to be 10 times better than like the average white
Yeah.
male to like be be sort of
Right.
in the same recognition level. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, Annie Rockfellow was, you know was such a pioneer in 1938, in 1916 up to 1938, and that we are in 2023, like 100 years after she was practicing, still like have some of these issues. I mean, we've gotten a lot, where we've gotten a long way, but definitely we have a long ways to go as well. So,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah, recognition is still an issue. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, so now at least nobody's going to scoff when you try to go to architecture school. So everyone will let you into architecture school. But
yeah.
then when you go out, and then you watch your dreams die. No, sorry. Sounds dramatic, but
Exactly. Right. Well, and unfortunately, because architecture is the way it is it's designed around, men who had wives, right? Who could spend like all day and all night
yeah,
at the office, right?
yeah.
Whereas women have caregiving duties. And so, I mean, it's all the system just feeds
Oh
into
yeah. Yeah. I mean, just the students that I saw in the architecture program where, I would teach a night seminar and I'm leaving at, I think 7 o'clock or something. And they are all just still in there working on these projects. And I thought, this is a good precedent to set,
Mhm.
that this
Absolutely.
is, and all of my friends that graduated from the program, and again, they're wonderful, talented people, but it was exhausting. It was absolutely exhausting. And it's not to say it shouldn't be rigorous, but
Mhm.
there's also this weird idea that that is what's going to make you a good architect. And it does go to your point, which is that the assumption is the people are going to take these jobs are the people that have, spouses that are going to take care of everything for them while they get to do this.
Mhm. Exactly. And that's how it was for most of architecture,
Yeah.
modern architecture that we know of, right? So, yeah, so no wonder the women are having a hard time catching up. So
Right.
yeah. Um, so I'll finish out with this last question. What do you think Annie Rockfellow's legacy should be? Like, what would you like to see for her legacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on it a little bit before, but again, the idea that the architects that we credit the sort of creation of Tucson's architecture and that aesthetic and that look, that she's part of that dialogue and that
Mhm.
her name is included in that list. And so many times I read, such and Drosler's the architect of Tucson. I'm like, not really. I mean, he did a lot
Mhm.
of houses,
Mhm.
but he didn't do much else, but so there's so many times where when we're talking about, the who's who of architecture, that her name has to be front and center in it, especially given the time period she worked, because she did work much earlier than a lot of these other people that we really laud and we really respect. And they came much later after her. Some people, it's possible that they took references from her work that we don't even know about.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so I think to me the biggest thing is making sure that she is part of that discussion and she is recognized for being one of the sort of founding creators of Tucson's aesthetic, for
Mhm.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. So not only being known for being the first woman registered architect, but really for being one of the more important architects, early architects
Yeah.
of Tucson. Yeah, for
Yes.
sure. And I wonder if some of the reason that she isn't more well known is possibly because the style that she worked in kind of lost popularity over time, and even
Yeah.
today we don't really like, we're so much into modernism. So
Yes.
the styles that came after her, that may be a reason why she's not in the mix of people we talk about.
Mhm.
Um, but again, we're trying to correct that because, like you said, she was probably a reference for these later
Mhm.
architects, and they probably didn't even know it. They probably thought it was Josted.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, like I think that's a good point about sort of what people's personal kind of interest aesthetic is right now, which is much more clean line, more contemporary, modern lines. And so, even so for us living now, we're looking at some of the modernist movement stuff going, oh my gosh, this is beautiful and wonderful, which is
Mhm.
now why Judith Chafee is suddenly coming into this discussion. And,
Mhm.
in the 70s, even though it made sense for what she was doing in the 1970s, she was still considered a little bit odd, a little bit out there. And so it was a very select number of people that would like her work. And now we look at this work and we're like, this is amazing and stunning and so ahead of its time. And and now we're really appreciating it, so because now it's an aesthetic that we liked. But
Mhm.
and so who knows, with people in the 40s and 50s were looking at Annie's, work going, oh wow, I really wish, it had been like that. But yeah, it is kind of interesting, just, taste change and that sort of thing. But yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and the best thing about Annie is, and these other women you're talking about, is that their work is still standing, and really that's their legacy as we kind of catch up socially to recognize more women. Their work is standing, her work is standing, and that's really significant. That is what is going to keep her, or bring her name out, eventually, and it is already. So I think
Yeah.
that's really a testament to how amazing she was. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that we are actively trying to preserve her work, because regardless of you know who it was, everybody can recognize it as something worthy of preservation, and that you know, and so even in all these years when people didn't know who did the work, you know, who designed the work, everybody's recognized them as properties that are important to us. So it's nice that it's now, you know, the credit is now sort of circling back around.
Yes, yes, that's wonderful. Yeah. Well, Jen, I really enjoyed our conversation today.
That's
That was
great.
so fun. Thank you
Yeah.
for introducing me to Annie Rockfellow. She's now one of my heroes. She's
Oh,
amazing.
good. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you for the time, and hope everybody goes out and looks for some Annie Rockfellow buildings next time they're in Tucson.
For sure. I certainly will. Thanks.
Yes, yeah. Let me know next time you're here. I'll take you on a tour.
Oh, I would love that. Thank